I've seen strange things in my life, but nothing haunts me like the crying tree. It's not just a name, not just some local legend. It's real. I heard it cry, and I saw what it left behind. I'm telling this story because maybe, just maybe, it'll stop someone else from going near it, because some trees should never be touched. It started with a dare. My friends and I, Andy, Claire, and Mark, were camping out in Grayson Woods, a sprawling forest that stretched for miles. We'd all grown up hearing the stories, whispers of a cursed tree, one that bled sap like tears and cried when no one was around. Andy was the one who suggested we find it. "Come on," he said, grinning as we sat around the campfire. "It's just an old ghost story. Let's prove it's not real." I wasn't so sure. Something about the way locals talked about the crying tree didn't feel like a joke. They avoided the subject entirely, their eyes darting to the ground as if even speaking of it was dangerous. But Claire and Mark were on Andy's side, and I didn't want to be the only one backing out. We set off the next morning, our gear strapped to our backs. Andy had an old map he'd downloaded online, one that supposedly marked the location of the crying tree. The deeper we went into the forest, the quieter it got. By the time we reached the marked spot, even the birds had stopped singing. The tree wasn't hard to spot. It stood alone in a small clearing, its gnarled branches twisting upward like claws. The bark was dark, almost black, with streaks of amber-colored sap running down its trunk. At first glance, it didn't seem like much, just an old, dying tree. But as we got closer, the air grew heavy, like the forest itself was holding its breath. And then we heard it. At first, it was faint, like the wind passing through the leaves. But it grew louder, more distinct. It was a sound I'll never forget, a low, mournful wail like someone crying out in pain. Claire froze. What is that?" she whispered. Andy laughed nervously. "It's probably just the wind," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. Mark took a step closer, his eyes fixed on the tree. "It's coming from inside," he said. I didn't want to believe him, but he was right. The sound wasn't coming from the forest, it was coming from the tree itself. Andy, always the bold one, walked up to it and placed a hand on the trunk. "See," he said, "it's just a tree." But as soon as he touched it, the crying stopped. The silence was so sudden, so complete, that it made my ears ring. "Let's go," I said, my voice shaking. But Andy shook his head. "No way, we came all this way, I want to see what's inside." He circled the tree, looking for some kind of hollow or opening. Claire and I hung back, but Mark followed him. "Here!" Andy called out. On the far side of the tree, hidden among the roots, was a small opening, just big enough for a hand to fit through. The edges were coated in sap, thick and sticky, and the smell was sickly sweet like rotting fruit. "Don't," I said, stepping forward. "This isn't right." Andy ignored me. He reached into the hole, his face twisting in concentration. For a moment, nothing happened. And then he screamed. He yanked his hand back, stumbling away from the tree. His fingers were covered in sap, but it wasn't just sap, it was red, like blood. "It burned me," he shouted, clutching his hand. Mark grabbed his backpack and pulled out a water bottle, pouring it over Andy's hand. The sap washed away, but his skin was raw, blistered. "We're leaving," I said firmly, grabbing Andy by the arm. But as we turned to go, the crying started again. This time, it was louder, more frantic. It sounded like multiple voices, overlapping, pleading, "Help me! Please don't leave! It hurts!" Claire clutched my arm, her face pale. "What's happening?" she whispered. I didn't have an answer. The air around the tree seemed to ripple, like heat rising off asphalt. And then we saw them, shadows, moving beneath the roots. At first, I thought it was just the light playing tricks on us, but the shadows grew clearer, taking on shapes, human shapes. They clawed at the dirt, their faces twisted in agony. "We have to go," I said, pulling Claire away. But Andy wouldn't move. He was staring at the tree, his eyes wide and unblinking. "Do you hear them?" he said. "They're asking for help." "Andy, stop!" Mark shouted, but it was too late. Andy reached out again, this time with both hands, pressing them against the trunk. The crying stopped once more, replaced by a deep, resonant groan that seemed to shake the ground. And then the tree moved. The roots uncoiled like snakes, tearing through the dirt. The shadows beneath them surged upward, their faces contorted into screams. "Run!" I shouted, grabbing Claire and Mark. Andy didn't move. He stood there, transfixed, as the shadows wrapped around him, pulling him toward the tree. His screams echoed through the clearing, mixing with the cries of the shadows. We didn't look back. We ran as fast as we could, crashing through the underbrush, the sounds of Andy's screams following us. By the time we reached the campsite, the forest was silent again. We waited for hours, hoping Andy would come back, but he didn't. When the sun rose, we returned to the clearing. The tree was there, just as we'd left it. But Andy was gone. The only sign of him was his backpack, lying at the base of the tree, coated in sap. We never spoke about it again. Claire moved away and Mark stopped going into the woods altogether. As for me, I can't forget. Sometimes, late at night, I hear the crying again. Faint, but unmistakable. I don't know what happened to Andy. I don't know if he's gone or if he's part of the tree now. But if you ever find yourself in Grayson Woods and you hear crying, don't follow it. And whatever you do, never touch the tree. In the weeks following that night, everything fell apart. Mark barely spoke to me anymore. The few times I saw him, he looked like a shell of himself. Sunken eyes, twitchy movements, like he couldn't shake something off. I overheard his parents talking at the grocery store one day. They said he was waking up screaming every night, crying about shadows crawling on the walls. Claire moved across the country within a month. I'd text her occasionally, but the replies were short, and eventually they stopped coming altogether. She didn't even say goodbye. As for me, I couldn't shake the feeling that the tree wasn't done with us. It started small. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the shadows, their faces, the way they clawed at the ground. I'd hear whispers in the quiet moments, just at the edge of hearing. "Help me. It hurts. Come back." I told myself it was my imagination, guilt, trauma, whatever you wanted to call it. But then the sap showed up. It started one morning when I woke up and found a sticky amber stain on my pillow. I thought maybe I'd scratched myself in my sleep and it was dried blood, but the smell was unmistakable, sickly sweet like the sap from the tree. I tried to ignore it, but it kept happening. On my clothes, my shoes, even the doorknob to my bedroom. The worst part, no one else seemed to notice. One night I woke up to the sound of crying, soft, almost childlike. My heart pounded as I sat up, straining to listen. It was coming from outside. I tried to tell myself it was just a neighbor, or maybe a stray animal, but deep down, I knew better. I grabbed a flashlight and stepped outside. The air was cold and the crying grew louder as I walked toward the edge of the woods behind my house. And then I saw it. Lying on the ground, half buried in leaves, was Andy's backpack. I froze, staring at it. There was no way it could be the same backpack. We'd left it by the tree. I wanted to turn back, to pretend I hadn't seen it, but something compelled me to move closer. I reached down, my hand trembling, and picked it up. The fabric was damp and sticky, covered in that same amber sap. As I held it, the crying stopped. Then the whispers began. "Help us. It hurts. Please." I dropped the backpack and ran back to the house, slamming the door behind me. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I went back to the spot where I'd found the backpack. It was gone. The whispers didn't stop. If anything, they grew louder, more insistent. I tried to block them out, blasting music, leaving the TV on at all hours, but they always found a way through. That's when I decided to do something I hadn't dared before: research. I spent hours digging through online forums, library archives, even conspiracy sites. Most of it was useless, urban legends, cryptid nonsense, but one name kept popping up: the Crying Tree Journal. It took weeks of searching, but I finally found someone who claimed to have a copy. An old man in a neighboring town living in a rundown trailer at the edge of the woods. When I knocked on his door, he didn't seem surprised to see me. "You heard it, didn't you?" he said, his voice gravelly and tired. I nodded. He invited me in and handed me a weathered notebook, its pages yellowed with age. "It's all in here," he said. "Everything you need to know." The journal was written by a man named Samuel Greer, a logger who'd worked in the area in the late 1800s. According to his account, the Crying Tree wasn't just a tree, it was a prison. Samuel wrote about a group of settlers who had come to the area long before the town was established. They were a small, tight-knit group, but rumors spread that they were practicing strange rituals. People started disappearing, and the settlers were eventually accused of witchcraft. The town rose up against them, burning their homes and hanging them in the woods. But their leader, a woman named Eliza, cursed the townspeople with her dying breath. "You'll never silence us," she said. "We'll cry for eternity, and your blood will keep us alive." The Crying Tree, Samuel claimed, grew on the very spot where they were buried. He believed the settlers' spirits had become trapped in its roots, bound to the tree but unable to escape. Samuel's final entry was the most chilling. "The tree is hungry. It needs blood to keep them quiet, but the more it takes, the louder they cry. I tried to ignore the journal, to put it out of my mind, but the whispers wouldn't let me. They were with me everywhere, at work, in the car, even in my dreams." One night I woke to find sap dripping from the ceiling. It pooled on the floor, thick and golden, forming a trail that led to my front door. I knew what it wanted. Grabbing a flashlight, I followed the trail into the woods. The air grew colder with every step, and the whispers turned into wails. When I reached the clearing, the tree was waiting. Its branches twisted in the wind, and the shadows beneath it writhed like living things. I don't know why I did it. Maybe I wanted closure. Maybe I wanted to end it. I stepped closer, placing my hand against the bark. For a moment, everything went silent. Then the ground opened beneath me, and the shadows surged forward. I woke up hours later, lying at the edge of the forest. My clothes were torn and my hands were coated in sap. The whispers were gone, but so was my sense of peace. I haven't been back to the woods since, but sometimes when the house is quiet I hear it, the soft, mournful cry of the tree, calling me back.